London, England, August 2008. Dark clouds are gathering in the twilight sky. The moon and sun admire each other, but my eyes are on him. His oversized glasses perched on his bulbous nose, the flashing blue and white lights of the television dancing on the lenses, his mawis hitched up around his knees. To see his knees buckling under the weight of his thin body hurts me. But I respect those knees for walking across continents, for wading through the Red Sea. I will sing the song of those knees. I am my father's griot. This is a hymn to him. I am telling you this story so that I can turn my father's blood and bones and whatever magic his mother sewed under his skin into history. Nadifa Mohamed, author, thank you for coming on the JSO interview.
Thank you.
We heard the opening lines of your novel, Black Mamba Boy, long listed for the Orange Prize for Fiction 2010. And the first thing to note, therefore, is that you actually live and work in England.
That's right.
I think I'm right in saying that those opening lines point to your literary concerns. You have taken the real life story of your father and fictionalized it.
That's right.
Perhaps you should say more since it's your book.
Well, my father's 88. He's had an incredible life that I only heard snippets of as I was growing up. I didn't really have anything that I could relate to from his life. He'd been a child soldier, he'd been a street boy, he'd been a farmer in these places that I'd barely heard of, in rural Eritrea and in Aden in Yemen. So as I got older, I became more and more interested in his stories. And at first I just wanted to record them in a very basic biographical way. But as I started writing up his story, it became much more, I was startled by just how intense his story was and the incredible things he did. At one point he wades across the Red Sea like Moses, and he survives this bomb attack which kills everyone else around him. So there was just this epicness to his life that called for fiction. And another necessity actually was that he could remember very, very small details about his childhood and his early life, but he didn't remember the emotional feelings he had at that time or the deeper side of him. So I had to step in and kind of imagine myself into a situation so I could write about that.
But again, for those who might not know, who have a wish, we're not going to give the book away, so to speak, but we have to fast forward to a time when your father eventually ends up in England and becomes, by extension, an English man, and you, of a certain generation, are a Somali English woman. Would you accept those labels?
I think because actually in our family, few people in our family have stayed in Somalia. We're migrants. So my father grew up outside of Somalia and I've grown up outside of Somalia. So our identity is always much more complicated than saying that we're just one or two things even. So I was born in Somalia, that was my first experience of life. Everything that I knew was Somali, and then I came quite abruptly to the UK. I went very abruptly and I always expected us to go back. I thought it was a temporary move, but it became more and more permanent as the war broke out. So I was very Somali, and then as time went on I became more British. But I do feel connections to the other parts of the world that my family have spent time in as well.
Well, perhaps we could return to that later, time permitting. What I would like to address at this point is this idea that the biographical detail was of great interest. So was there a call to embellish this life, to make it fiction? Why didn't you, nobody would have read the book if you just said the story of Jama Mohammed and left it at that?
No, I don't think it needs any embellishment. His story is very unusual, it's extraordinary.
Right.
So the details of the novel are 90% factual.
But the very definition of fiction is that you must have created some other characters.
No, I think fiction is more complicated than that. So there are created characters based on people he's told me about, who did exist, and sometimes people that I've imagined into life. But
you imagined them into life, made them angry, made them have qualities that made his story more readable rather because you'd have been concerned to convey the truth. Now, am I going to accuse you of conveying a dream world, an imaginary world?
It's interesting because my father doesn't read fiction. He believes in non-fiction really only. He believes that there's a truth and there's non-truth or falsehood. But I don't think it is that way. When we've talked about his memories and I've compared them to textbooks or history books, there's often a variance. And it's because every person perceives life differently. So he remembers the battles in Eritrea as being, you know, bad, but not that bad. While if you read English accounts, British accounts, you know, it was scorchingly hot, it was carnage, it was incredibly bad. So where is the truth there? I'm trying to be completely accurate, not fictionalize at all. But I'm having to step in and mediate between all of these different accounts.
But the audience, therefore, there would be a bigger audience. Is there a bigger audience per se for fiction as opposed to biography?
I don't think so. I think non-fiction is very successful. It sells very well. So if I wanted to write a biography, I could have written a biography. But you didn't choose that path? Because there was some emotional depth lacking for me. I couldn't write it that way.
Right.
It didn't tell the story in a way that I thought did justice to the story.
The accusation then is that since you're creating, that there are certain things that the local people who might live in Hargeisa or Eritrea is a commonplace, but in your writing for the man or woman on the Clapham omnibus, you are in a way creating a fictional world which is so outside their reality that's why they read your book as opposed to, you know, shopping in Regent Street as a title for a novel.
No, I don't think so. I don't think I write for the person on the Clapham omnibus. I think I write for myself. And I was motivated by a desire to read a book that I knew that I would never find anywhere else, to write a book that I would never find anywhere else. I'd never heard of a story like my father's, of that person, of that, you know, a poor African boy growing up in Aden and somehow through the support of the wider community and his mother making something of himself against all the odds. So I wanted to write about that moment in time, and I have just as many Somali readers as I do non-Somali readers.
Would you think that it's unfair, because I'm still also going to plug on at this a bit, that you found for your first novel exotic subject matter, because you could as well have written about your experience in England and that of a Somali young woman in England?
And I probably will.
So is there what do you call it, a sort of a grouping of people throughout the world who could come into this thing of having a sort of nostalgic look to where they came from and saying, I'll write about that, rather than where you are?
I think you can write about both. I think I didn't want to write. It wasn't an ambition of mine. It wasn't part of my life plan. It was my father's story that made me want to write. So I wouldn't have been interested in writing about my ordinary life in London. I will write about my life in London, I think, in the future, because things are coming together that I find very interesting. But at that moment in time, it was his particular story that I became obsessed with. And I needed the depth of it. I needed the breadth as well to be committed. It took 4.5 years. And I knew that I was reading things and learning things that was so hard to find and had value of their own.
Right, well you're leading me, because every author who comes into a platform such as this, and I'm sure you've given lots of talks, you've talked about 4.5 years. Just exactly how did you go about it? You know, people sort of ask writers, what time do you wake up? What do you have for breakfast? You drink a glass of water. It's always fascinating. The one thing that's a given is it's a solitary craft. You have to sit down and write.
Yes.
But apart from that, you've suggested that you recorded Dad speaking.
Yes, I interviewed him. I interviewed him, did a series of interviews both in Somali and in English. And he collaborated with me on the book. He was very close, and any questions I had, I would pick up the phone and ask him, and we would discuss it. We'd go over old maps together. We went to the Imperial War Museum, where they have old film reels from Tessenay and other parts of Eritrea, where he knew the places that he'd grown up and he hadn't seen before on film. So that was really lovely, and I liked working with him. I really enjoyed the research aspect. I studied history and politics at university, so that's always been an interest of mine, examining the political situation, examining the historical situation. And I hope that all of that fed into the book. And that's one of the reasons I took so much time to write, because it was a slow process. You can't find Somali history in a particular place or Eritrean history in a particular place. You kind of have to glean it from lots of different sources.